we're trying to curate how we're going to be seen in order to protect ourselves. And the biggest task of memoir is stripping that away and letting our past and how we showed up for it be the story.
Create for No Reason is your weekly dose of inspiration to create what you believe should exist in the world. It's where passion meets craft, and we explore the joy of the creative process and building a meaningful body of work. I am so excited about this episode. If you want to publish a book or just become a better writer, this is it. We have all the things that you need in this episode. I was joined by my friend Emily Gindlesparger. She is an author, an editor, a ghostwriter, and she has coached over 400 authors along their path to writing, editing, and publishing their life's work. So she knows all the fears and all the challenges that writers go through to actually put their work out into the world. The authors that she's worked with have become Wall Street Journal bestsellers and Indie Book Award winners, and she has helped people publish traditionally as well as self-publishing. We talk all things writing process. We get into memoir, nonfiction, and just the challenges of what it takes to get your work out into the world. You're going to love this episode. Enjoy. Emily, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to see you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you too.
So this is going to be a really fun show. I feel like we are reconnecting after many years. And I first met Emily during online, of course. And it was back in 2020 during the pandemic when everyone kind of started doing these online courses and online webinars. And you guys had this really wonderful writing workshop. And I was like, I have been talking about writing a book for so many years. And so I joined you, and it was such a great experience. And it really kind of catapulted this journey of me writing my first book. So thank you, and Tucker and your team that I got to spend some time with for many months. I so appreciate all the work that you are doing to help people get their books out into the world.
Well, thank you. It's such a joy to see your book on the shelf behind you after, I saw it at the very early stages when you had, as I recall, you had so much passion and so much drive, and it took you a while to find the direction to match that. And so it's really, really cool to see what you funneled it into.
Oh, well, you played such a role in that. And it's so funny that you remember that, because I remember some of our calls, and you're so calm, and you're so caring for people's work, and you really believe in their work so much. And so I always loved our conversations, because no matter where I was, you always gave me such encouragement and support, and also really good direction, even that tough love that you need. And so I appreciate that in the work that you do. And I'm really excited about this conversation, because a lot of the listeners, they have a book inside of them. They have an idea. They've been thinking about it. They've been talking about it. And maybe they've even dabbled. A lot of my friends, I know, they have pages and pages written, and they just don't know really where to go with it. And you are a writer, and you have helped so many people publish their books. You've ghost written over 40 books, or what a crazy number. And so we're going to talk all about the writing process, how to get your idea out into the world. And I wanted to start with this, because I always am fascinated when people that do what you do. Do you think that anyone can become a great writer?
I do. I think it requires really stripping back what is great writing in the first place. And great writing is just great communication. It's nothing more fancy than that. And so if you know how to speak to someone, well, at least one person, even if it's just someone that you love, if you know how to speak to them and tell them what's in your heart and do that clearly, then writing is just that same thing done on a page. And I think that people often put a lot of hurdles in front of themselves before they allow themselves to practice their own writing. They confuse great writing with what sells or what's in the library or what they see other people reading or what they admire even, and they look at all of those things and say, well, I could never write like that, so therefore I must never get to become a great writer. And the reality is that when you practice just communicating clearly and strip it down to as basic as you possibly can, and you practice that over and over and over, that's how you become the best writer that you can be, right? And there are so many amazing examples of really simple books that didn't have any fancy writing at all. It was just somebody communicating clearly what their experience was.
I almost feel like those perennial sellers are the simplest books. They are
Often they
those
are.
they are people that know how to take these big ideas and big concepts and then strip them down so that when we're reading it, we often think, "Oh my gosh, why didn't I come up with that?" Or, "He
Mhm.
said what I've been thinking," or, "She wrote this in a way," like, how did she even come up with these words, and how did she know how to string them along this way? I feel like that's one thing as a writer that is interesting is when we read other people's work, we tend to put people on this pedestal and think, "Oh, they just sat down and wrote this," and we forget what the creative process, right? Like, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's so easy for us to forget what the creative process is like. So talk a little bit about, what is that writing process? Is it, some people say it has to be hard and grueling and it sucks. Like, is that true? Does it have to be hard and difficult to actually write and create a really wonderful writing habit?
Oh, that's a really good and kind of loaded question because in my experience, it is hard, right? But I certainly don't confuse my experience with everybody's experience. I have met writers that are able to write with joy, or at least they say that they write purely with joy and that the process is not hard. So I'm sure that that's out there. But I think more often than not, it is a process that has some friction because what you're really doing when you're writing is you're trying to get as precise as you can about what you think and feel and what you observe in the world. And that level of precision can take a lot of tries. It can take a lot of thought. And so for me, the friction that I feel in my writing process usually isn't about the words themselves. It's about like getting clear on what is my experience? What do I think I have to say? Right. And sometimes I have my own mental blocks around that. And so it's that emotional work that I have to do to fuel the writing work. And when I do the emotional work, the writing work is a lot easier.
Oh, but the emotional work is it's a lot. It could be a lot.
It can be.
When
Yeah. And
when
yet so gratifying, right? Like it's certainly the case with me that I'm always writing the book that I need to work through. And as a ghostwriter, having worked with lots of people's material in super depth, like we all are writing the books that we need. And so when the book that you're trying to create is also on the edge of your own learning edge, right? Like you're trying to write about something that you're going through right now or something that you're trying to understand right now, there's always going to be friction in that. And it's always going to be a little bit hard because otherwise you would know it and it would be rote and it would be easy to write and thus maybe not as fulfilling to write.
writers learn a lot about how they think about something through the writing process. I mean, that's
Mhm.
really, you have to get it out of your head and onto the page and then figure out where you wanna go with it. And I often find where sometimes I'll write and I feel like it's a thing. Actually, I think you mentioned this in one of your videos. So let's talk about this because I want to always write from a place of joy. I don't always write from a place of joy because sometimes I'm feeling frustrated and I want it to be perfect. I want to get out the right words and I want to create something immediately. And I will sit down and I'll start writing and I'll think, I have this idea. I know it's something. I just don't know how to get there. And so I feel a little bit
Mhm.
frustrated and I almost feel like, should I even try? Should I work through this? Is this anything? And I kind of just go back and forth with that, which is ridiculous because just sit down and do it, right? Like if
Yeah,
you're going
yeah.
to figure it out, and the only way to do it is to sit it down and do it. So when you're in that place of this is not great work, like how do you sit down and write consistently when you kind of don't always feel like what you're creating is worth it?
Well, a big piece of that is separating what I'm trying to make the final product to be from what needs like, what's the raw material that needs to get out so that I can make that final product from it. You probably remember back when you were in our writing program, like we teach to write a vomit draft first, meaning you're not even trying to make anything good or anything necessarily that you enjoy. You're just trying to like spit out a bunch of stuff to see what you even have in front of you. And a lot of people resist doing that because it means making a big mess that you have to clean up later. And that's really intimidating. And it means wandering around and letting yourself off the hook to make sense or make things pretty or make things clean. And that can be I mean, speaking from my own experience, when I really let myself go and do like a classic vomit draft, like I don't care what anyone thinks, I don't even care what I think of myself. This is just what's in me today. Like I look back on that and I judge myself pretty hard sometimes. I had like part of the emotional practice that I was talking about is refraining my own judgment from what I created when I let myself off the hook. and like really being able to sit with that and decide like, okay, what of that mess do I want to keep working with? And I think writing, maybe this is like a grandiose claim, but I think that writing suffers from that mm, jumping ahead kind of problem more than many other art forms because it's just words. We use language all the time, right? Like everybody knows how to use language to a degree, and so we put so much pressure on ourselves to use our language perfectly right from the gate. But if you were, for example, making a clay pot, you would know that like first you scoop out a mound of clay and then you have to wedge it. You have to like knead it and get all of the air out. And then you have to put it on the wheel and you have to center it and then you have to like get the walls of your pot even. Like there are so many steps involved in just getting the raw material and purifying it and preparing it and then making the thing that you want to make. And we forget that there's those very same steps built into every creative process, including writing, because we're so used to conversations where we just say what we want to say and it's done. And writing, you say what you want to say and then you have to go over and look at it and see if that's what you want to print. Yeah.
Yes. And when you're working with someone on that, how do you help them make the decision and go with it? Because I often feel like if I keep going back to my work, I keep wanting to change it. And as we
Mhm.
grow and as you read more and write more, of course you're going to want to change it because now you have new language, you have new inspiration to pull from. So when you're working with people to actually publish a book, how do you decide, okay, this is it? It needs no more editing because I've seen a lot of friends, even not even a book, just an article or something they've been working on, they just hold it so close to them. They will not release it because they keep on playing around with it when really it's so good. And if they were able to get that out into the world, they can move on to something else. So, how do you
Yeah.
help your people through that?
Well, first, it's recognizing that you as the creator, and this is so sad, but the reality is that you as the creator are never going to get to enjoy like the full force of awe for what you create. That awe and that admiration is for other people to enjoy about your work. It's not something that you're ever going to see because you're the creator. And we all learn by doing when we're creating something. You learn to be a better writer by writing your thing and making it better and rewriting it and and perfecting it. And that means that your writing skill is always growing alongside the thing that you are writing. So that's why you can perfect it endlessly because you're always going to become a better writer the more that you work on it. And I remember the tipping point in my own book when I realized like okay, I could keep fiddling with this. I could add more stories. I could make the stories that are in there better. There are still so many things that I could do. But if I was going to make that worth my time, if I was going to make it 10% better, that would mean going into this entire book and rewriting it all over again with the more skill that I have now, right? That I didn't have back when I made the vomit draft of this book and then started editing and refining it. And do I actually want to commit another 6 months to a year to doing that whole process just to reflect where I am now, knowing that I'm also going to grow and then be even better? And then, like, will I want to rewrite it again? So at some point, I had to figure out and really artificially draw a line in the sand of like, this is where I'm going to just say my book is done. I know that it doesn't reflect the skill that I have now, and it never will. So I know that I'm putting something out there that is not as good as what it could be if I published it in 5 years. And I'm just going to be okay with that because getting it out is more important to me than continuing to practice my craft on this particular piece of work. And and so you just decide where that line is for you and then make your book a time capsule of this is what I thought and this is how good I was at expressing it at this particular time. And getting it out into people's hands is now the more important goal than getting better at this particular piece of work. But it's
Mm.
hard. That line is different for everybody. How did you find that line for yourself on your own book?
Well, it's interesting because one of my mentors said to me, "When you publish a book, it's no longer yours.
Yeah.
It belongs to the reader." And he said, "Do you think that people need this book?" And I said, "Yes, that's why I wrote it." And he's like, "Right." It kind of reminds me of Elizabeth Gilbert because she talked about how when she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, so many people would ask her about how do you feel like how does it feel to maybe have created the best thing you will ever create? Because is there another
Oh.
chance that right? Can you imagine that?
Oh, that's all I got? Oh,
Oh my god,
no.
but it was like but she said that or she would get asked that because it was such a huge success. Like, what are the chances you're gonna write another book, it's becoming a Netflix series and sell millions of copies? Mark Manson said the same thing about The Subtle Art, right? Like, he said the same thing about his book, and it was like, it was a great book, but a lot of luck in that he so that his that this book that he wrote got millions and millions of copies. He wrote another book. It didn't do as well, but it was almost like he said, "Of course it didn't. What are the
Mhm.
chances it's going to do?" So it was so interesting. I think about that a lot because to me it feels like you write the book and you get to share it and say, "Hey, I created any piece of art. I created this for you. I hope you love it." And now you get to go do something else and create something else. And so what I loved about Elizabeth Gilbert's answer was that it was something along the lines of it doesn't matter. I'm going to keep creating. I'm going
Yeah.
to, and that's what I always say. I always just in my mind, I'm thinking, keep creating. Write this poem. I think it could be better, but I'm going to put it out and now I'm going to go create something else because it's meant for someone. Someone's going to find it. And I love what you said about how other people are going to get that moment of love or whatever it means to them and you don't necessarily get it from your own work. I really love that. That really hit home for me because I feel that way and I feel if we can create something that other people love, that is there's so much joy in that. So I'll just enjoy that and then move on and hopefully create something else
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
meaningful.
And especially since I've devoted my particular writing career to books specifically, right? Which, like, a long form piece of art that takes a long time to create. Um, I think what intimidates people most about that idea is that often when they're beginning their first book, they can't imagine that they could write more than one, right? Like, they think this is my life's work. I'm putting it all in here. And I think that it's almost like that belief in our own limitation or that disbelief that we have more creative energy than even just this one huge project ends up causing us to hold on too tightly to it.
Oh, yes. That's how I felt, Emily.
Oh, I
I was
know.
almost
We talked about that, didn't we? Yeah.
Yeah, it was really challenging, and so then when I thought, "Oh, but I can create" now, I mean, that's part of the reason why I wanted to continue this podcast because there's lots of things that I wanna create, and it's just creating this body of work that it's a book, it's a podcast, it's poems, it's a workbook, it can be whatever I want it to be. I can create whatever I wanna create, and I do know I have another book inside of me, and I think part of me wanted to I was finished with the first book, and immediately I thought, "I have to write this next book." Okay, calm down. Maybe just wait for some of the ideas to get out into the world. And so creators are very interesting because we always kind of have that need for creating. And it's almost like you're only, what is that phrase? You're only as good as your last project or your last book. It's like that's not a great way to to approach your creative work. But that being said, when I think about a creative habit and the writing habit, I had to create a writing habit. And this I think this was from you guys where I set a goal for myself to write at least 250 words a day to finish the book. Do you have a writing habit and how important is it to have a writing habit? Does it have to be daily? Does it have to be at the same time? Like what are your thoughts around that?
Oh, yeah. I first, again, this is another like choose your own adventure. Everybody operates a little differently. And it's really important as a creator to get to know your own creative rhythms and do what works for you. Right. So, like, I have my own routine, which I'll talk about. But I certainly am by no means saying that people should copy my specific habits because they're the only ones that work. Right. This is just like, this is what my rhythm looks like. And so, my rhythm looks like my best shot at getting decent work is to write in the morning before I start working for other people and getting distracted by what I'm trying to produce for others. Now, for me, I write memoir, so like that's a very specific kind of internal and emotional place that I am trying to preserve while I'm creating. And the morning for me is the best time to do it. Either morning or sometimes late night, like before bed when I'm really tired and I just don't have the mental bandwidth anymore to criticize myself. And so like right after I get up or right before I'm going to go to bed are the best times to sort of circumvent that inner editor, that critical part of my brain. So that's a really important part for me is time of day that allows the time of day where I'm most likely to let myself off the hook and actually create freely as opposed to trying to go from the first word that I write to it. I have a finished sentence that will definitely be published, right? I'm trying to never put that expectation on myself. And because I write memoir and it is such an emotional experience, I often find that I need more time than just my writing time. Like there's time to kind of set the stage for myself and ground and breathe and just like be ready to go into a deeper place within myself. So I have a little bit of like meditation and prep that I do for that and then I write and then some days there'll be big emotions that come up and so I need to spend another 15-20 minutes just sitting with those feelings and letting whatever that creative process brought up to roll through so that I'm not then trying to jump out of that into my day or jump into an interaction with somebody else and I find that if I don't take that time to kind of decompress I just set myself off up to be really frazzled the whole day because I still have kind of this background energy that hasn't moved through yet. And so that kind of buffering on either end to give myself time to like center and feel is really helpful. And in terms of frequency, I don't necessarily think that everybody has to write every day, but the benchmark for me is there too much time between my writing sessions that I'm forgetting where I left off or forgetting
Mhm.
like I'm forgetting the thread, right? And so I want to write often enough that the thread stays continuous in my mind and I can keep picking it up and adding to it every session. And so for me, that pretty much looks like every day. Oftentimes I'll take weekends off of writing, but I really have to have regular contact with my work. Otherwise, it's like every time I sit down, I have to re-download what what this project even is and what I'm trying to say. And that like reviewing what I've written before or trying to refresh myself can often trigger that editor brain again, where it's like you reread something and then you want to go back and perfect it because you can see what's wrong with it right now. And you just want just a quick thing that I want to tweak and like make better. And that's not ever my goal when I'm like in actual writing time. Editing time is different, and my rhythms for editing look different. But writing time is daily, and it's all about trying to manage the environment and my psyche so that that critical inner part of me doesn't creep in.
How do you become a better writer with this habit? If you're writing, whether it's every day, every other day, whatever your writing habit becomes, how do you recommend people get better at their writing, especially if they don't have an editor or they don't have a community and they want to know that their work is consistently getting better? I mean, we can write every day, but if we're not actually learning or growing, what is that? Does that actually serve us? Or so how can we create some habits that will actually help us to improve in our writing?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I do want to say like the value of community and the value of an editor cannot be understated. Like I really think I totally recognize that some folks are not in like an economic position to gather those resources around them, but those are for sure the best resources that I know of to help me become a better writer. It's like it's very much like choosing a therapist and going to therapy, right? Like you can spend all day trying to feel your feelings and think through what's going on with you, but it's really the relationship that you have with that other person and being able to bounce ideas off of them and being able to be heard and seen. That's what changes you. And it's the same with writing. An editor is so pivotal for helping reflect back to you like this is what you've put on the page and this is the experience that you're creating for the rest of us. And is that the experience that you're trying to create? How do you get closer to what you wanted? So anyway, pin in that part. How do you get better at writing on your own? You know, I think the first step is volume. I think the first step is write a lot and experiment with the way that you like to write and the best time of day where you feel where the writing feels the most fun and engaging. People disagree on this. I also read a lot, and I find value in reading things and then practicing kind of mimicking other authors, just, playing around and seeing like, what does it feel like to write this way? What does it bring out in me? Which is not the same as finding your voice through other people, but it's like you're starting to analyze what are the skills that other people are using, what are the techniques they're using, and kind of adding all those techniques to your toolbox. And so high volume of writing, high volume of reading, and just lots of freedom to play. I think those are the biggest ingredients that have done the most for me. But there's also a really huge piece that I've gone through where, I went to college for writing. I was taught to write by analyzing and copying other writers and trying to become a great writer, like the way that I saw other writers being great. And what that led to was a huge focus on trying to write really fancy and like write things that looked impressive on the page and write things that are like lyrical and beautiful and like the language is so poetic and yada yada yada. And I'm not denigrating any of those things, but for me, ultimately there came a point where all of those techniques got in the way of me being clear and got in the way of me
Mm,
really getting to the core of what I wanted to say and getting to my truth. And so, to a degree, some of what my own writing practice has actually been stripping away all of that. Like, what is it that I think my writing should look like? And instead, just try to write a simple thing that is true. Like you said that 250 words a day was your practice while you were writing your book. I nowadays I focus on writing at least one true sentence when I sit down.
mm.
And I try explicitly not to make it fancy or pretty because I've noticed the way that manipulating my language in that way in the past has caused me to like hide a little. So it's funny because the pieces of that I just talked about kind of conflict each other, right? It's like read, write, study techniques, practice those techniques, play with them, but also forget all of that
Don't do
and
any of
just
that.
and just write the simple thing. I think both sides of that coin are really, really valuable for gaining skill and flexibility and like the ability to write in a bunch of different ways and ultimately find the best way for you to communicate.
I love to read, and part of it, it's interesting when you read differently because
Yeah.
you're not only reading the story, but you're also, why did they choose it that way? Or I would have reworded it, or I would have worded it differently. Or it seems like sometimes I feel like it's very basic. Like a lot of the authors that can just churn out 20 books, they have the formula. It feels very formulaic. It's
Mhm.
almost like a Lifetime movie. You know what's
Mhm.
going to happen if you start watching it. Whereas other people's writing is more surprising, it's different. But I wrote that down. I love that. A simple thing that is true. You write a simple thing that is true. And it's interesting to see how collectively when you read a lot and you read other people's work, it does influence our work, whether you wanted to or not. And so it's like find things that you really, really love and then figure out what you love about it. Like your
Yeah.
favorite authors, what do you love about reading your favorite authors? That's what I
Yeah.
love. I'm thinking, why do I love this so much? What is it? How is it different than all these other things that I'm not as curious about? And I find that to be really a fun way to kind of improve my writing. But I agree with you. I'm part of a writing community, and I think it's so helpful to hear other people's writing. You'd be able to work with them to improve their skills, and then they get to do the same for you. And I feel like, and having an editor, like a real editor, is definitely the best thing because
It's
they
a
see your work.
non-negotiable for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you're writing a
Yeah.
book, you 100% need an editor. So you work on Memoir. I find it to be very interesting. Even when I think about Memoir and when people are putting out these memoirs, it's so vulnerable. If you put out a
Mhm.
really good memoir, you're really telling a story about your life and all the things that you've gone through. How does someone decide? Like if someone's listening and they have a book inside of them and they're thinking, oh, I'm going to write a nonfiction book. What's the difference between writing a memoir or writing a nonfiction book that just has a lot of stories around your past or some of your experiences?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of different ways to think about the differences. The key thing that I always think about is, do you have a destination in mind for your reader? Or do you want to let them explore inside of your story? And when you have a destination for them, you are pretty surely in the round of prescription nonfiction. The realm, sorry, not the round, the realm of prescription nonfiction. Meaning, like, you have an idea of where you want to help the reader get to. You have an end destination in mind, a skill you want to help them grow, an insight you want to help them have. And so your book then is constantly directing them in that vein. And when somebody goes to a book with an expectation that they're going to learn something, that's exactly what they want. They want to be led, right? But when somebody opens up a memoir, what they want is they want to experience, not to be led. They want to see for themselves what they think of the life that you've put on the page so that they can figure out like what resonates with me and what do I think of my own life. The only reason we any ever pick up memoirs or even fiction books is to like learn something about how we see ourselves, right? And so memoir collapses, like it really falls apart the moment that you start trying to push your reader to thinking about your story in a specific way or thinking about you in a specific way. Like the most vulnerable thing about memoir is actually pulling back your sense of how you want to be seen or judged and just describing exactly what your experience was and what you felt, leaving it plain as it is, and then letting people have their own experience of that and draw their own conclusions about what they think of you and your story. And it's like, it's a very, very vulnerable place to be. But when you allow yourself to go all the way there, you're going to pull out the most genuine story that's the most full of the human experience, right? And so I think of prescription nonfiction as being like the map. You're giving a reader the path to follow to a destination. And memoir is more like you're just strapping a camera on your chest and walking, and they're just along for the ride, and you don't know where you're going to go, right? Even if you know what the story is and where it begins and ends, you still are going to bring them on to a more open-ended emotional experience. Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges that you help your students go through? Because this is what you do. You help people write their memoir.
Hmm.
What most often comes up when people are working through it? Because I imagine it's a process. It's a
Oh, it's
process to get there.
Yeah. In the beginning, the biggest question that people have is, can this be a good memoir? Like, do I have a book in me? Is this story worth telling? And there are so many different answers to that question. But at the core of that question is this fear that I'm going to spend a whole lot of time writing my story and figuring out how to portray it on the page, and it won't have been worth it because I will be judged, or I will, like, it won't be quote unquote good. And the problem with that, or the kind of bigger question of that, is that when people are holding that question in their minds, and I, by the way, like, I'm not immune to this. I wrote the entire first draft of my first book. I feel a little guilty about this. I sent it to my best friend and I was like, I just need you to read this and I need you to tell me that I don't have a story here, because I want to give up on this. I'm feeling so vulnerable. It feels like it's not worth it to put this out in the world. So I need you to tell me to stop, which is a very loaded, like, of course, that's not what she's going to tell me.
Of course.
But but obviously what I was seeking was, like, could this internal experience that I tried to be so vulnerable about, could it possibly be valuable to anybody else? Or is it just going to expose me? Right. That's what I had in my mind. And the reality is that if I don't value my own story, and if I don't dig deep to figure out why my own story is worthy to me, then I can't convey that to other people either. And so the start of finding a great memoir inside yourself is like the inner work of figuring out how you value yourself, how you value yourself and your past. And so there are so many facets to untangling that and coaching around that, but that's typically what we're focusing on.
I can only imagine what those calls must be like and the tears that must be shed during many conversations.
Yeah. They're so beautiful, and the most beautiful thing about it, actually, especially now that I've been focusing on just memoir for the last year, and, like, really going deep and getting a lot of exposure to authors in various stages of their drafts, is often what we're trying to help people uncover when we edit their memoir material is the ways that they are hiding their own power, their own worth, their own compassion even, and, like, judging themselves in the writing and trying to explain. It comes back to what I said earlier about, like, in memoir, you don't the reader doesn't want you to tell them what they should think about your story, or to try to see you in a specific way. They wanna see you the way that they see you based on their own experience, right? And what I see in people's early drafts is often that they're trying to cure. We all do this. I do it too. We're trying to curate how we're going to be seen in order to protect ourselves. And the biggest task of memoir is stripping that away and letting our past and how we showed up for it be the story without trying to explain it.
Yeah, I'm sure you don't have a favorite, but I don't even love when people ask me, "What's your favorite anything?" Because I'm like, "I don't have a favorite any," like, come on, there's too many amazing things, but what are some of your favorite memoirs that maybe just in the last few years that you've read or that you recommend often that you just love, that you go back to often?
Oh, I have so many favorites. Probably my very favorite is one that was published, I think it was back in the 90s. It's called Red Azalea by Anchi Min. She's a Chinese author, Chinese American, emigrated, I think, when she was in her 20s. And she grew up in communist China during the leap forward. I wish I could remember the name of that campaign. Like, basically during the most shut down stringent time of the communist agenda in China, and like millions of people died of famine while that was happening. Anyway, she tells the story of what happened to her family and what happened to her as the culture went through this shift of being prescribed where you're going to live and what job you're going to do, and basically like what your life is going to look like. And she talks about falling in love in that atmosphere. She talks about, like finding her passion, all against this backdrop of social control. And the reason why I love that memoir and I keep returning to it is because it's such a beautiful example and a very dramatic one, right? Obviously, nobody, not nobody, but most people don't have a story that's that like clearly dramatic. But it illustrates the way that a culture imposed a certain kind of life on a person, and how she, in ways both subtle and overt, tried to break that down and live a life that was her own. And I think that that is the story that all of us are telling when we're going to write memoir. Like, we're telling the story that is just our own, separate from what society tells us we should think about ourselves, or what our family taught us about how we should think about ourselves, and we're really uncovering our own truth. And so that's what I keep returning to when I think about what makes memoirs great.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'll have to read that. It sounds like a beautiful memoir. Memoirs and biographies and autobiographies, we love them for a reason, right? Because of what you're describing. I want to hear someone's story. I've read so many nonfiction books that I've got to the place over the last few years where I thought, okay, I've read all of these books that are telling me how to do stuff, how to improve, how to be better, how to, which I love, but memoir and biographies are just so different. I'm like, I just want to hear how you did it. Just
Yeah.
take me through your journey. And from that, you learn so much. You learn so much about the tactics, the strategies, and able to kind of look at how you can use how this person showed up in the world and take some of those same ideas. And they're very inspiring. You are also very inspiring with your many tips that you give on your Instagram. So I'll link your Instagram for people to follow you, because you share really wonderful writing tips, whether you're writing fiction, nonfiction, or memoir. I think they're very relevant. And I know, obviously, we're not going to go through all of them, but can you share maybe three of your top favorite, like a little quick fire, three writing tips for someone who's in that space of, I want to be a better writer and I have a book inside of me? And what are some of your top three writing tips that you love to share?
Oh, yeah. I'd say the first one is actually a simple little hack that I keep returning to and use almost on the daily, that helps me get into that vomit draft writing mode outside of the editor mind, which is that if I sit down to write and nothing is coming and I'm just spinning, 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 it's usually because I feel like I haven't landed on the right way to say the first thing. And so I will start with this sentence frame that's just, here's what I would say if I wasn't worried about what you think. And then I start writing, and guaranteed it always unlocks, like, it that always gets me started, because it helps me remember that when I'm frozen, it's because I feel like other people are watching me, and the reality is that no one is. And I just have
Mm.
to keep anchoring into that and remembering that I have a safe space for myself to play. So that's the really big one. The other one, which circles back to like what we were talking about with creative rhythms, I'd say the second simple tip is, I write when I'm tired. I write. Most people think that they should find the part of the day where they're most energized and they have the most creative ideas. And the reality is that that state for me also means that more of my brain is turned on, which means more of my inner critic is turned on. And when I have a huge flood of ideas, it's really hard to like find the forest for the trees, right? Like, sometimes I actually have to let all of that settle and then see what rises to the top after that flurry of ideas. And so I find that really zoning in on the times of day when I'm tired is a way to kind of shut some of those more hyperactive parts of my brain down, and just trust that what comes up when I'm tired is like the titrated thing that floated to the top, and it's the most important thing. And it's a lot easier for me to write that way, and for me to respect what comes out. Because it came up while I was tired, then it was still important, right? It got past all the filters.
Ooh, I like that. That's like it reminds me of Julia Cameron's her morning pages.
Oh, yeah.
Right
Yeah, very much.
first
Mhm.
thing in the morning, right when you wake up, before your brain has a chance to really get into it. And so I love that. All right, one more.
Yeah. The third, I like to think about like a weightlifting analogy, right? That like nobody expects to go from not going to the gym to walking into a weight room and slapping 150 pounds on a barbell and being able to just do whatever they want with it, right? Like you would seriously injure yourself. And so it is with writing. Like you're never going to go, or at least I don't go from nothing on the page to I can do anything I want with this page and it's going to turn out perfectly. And so trusting that the story is going to reveal itself in layers is one of the most important things for me. And oftentimes when I'm writing, I will go over the same story a few times in like the span of a week. And the first level that I write will be just the bare bones basics like, this is what happened. I don't really want to get into all of it, right? Like I'm just kind of like sketching out the basics. And then day 2, I'll start to go in and like, okay, that happened. What more detail can I remember just about this one chunk? And I'll kind of like slowly start adding layers of detail and layers of emotion and building that story up. And that for me is a much easier way to get out something that turns out well than to try to think it all through and then get it all on the page in one go. That just doesn't happen for me.
Yeah. It doesn't happen, period. Like who does that? I mean, it just does it, right? I mean,
I have talked to writers who claim that it happens to them. There was a really interesting conversation actually with Wade Davis, who's an anthropologist and an excellent writer, and Tim Ferriss. They were talking on his podcast about writing, and they both said like they're one draft and done kinds of writers. In fact, I think Wade said something like, "Yeah, people say that you should write a vomit draft, but I've never been able to make anything pretty out of vomit." Right? Like that advice just is nonsense to me. But what he described about his process was he spends a very, very long time, months or years, writing an incredibly detailed outline for himself. And in
mm,
my view, that's kind of your vomit draft. It's just in
yeah.
a form, right? So he's spent all this time doing all of the intellectual work of what he's writing. And then when he goes to draft it, he's already got all those dots connected. He already knows exactly what he wants to say. He's already worked it out and rehearsed it a bunch in his mind. And so, like, yeah, in that situation, it is going to come out easier the first time, well, because you already put all the pieces together. So I bring up that example to say, like, the way that we build these layers and the way that we perfect our writing can look very different. It doesn't always look like write a long form thing and then edit long form thing. It might be write some bullets and then flesh that out into more of an outline and then think about it. And then finally you're ready to write. But knowing that anything that you write is going to go through these iterative phases, I think helps to take the pressure off of trying to lift that heavy weight all at once.
Yeah. And then one day we can all be like Wade and Tim. And but that it's interesting because I know a lot of speakers, like Jay Bear. Jay Bear is an author, a speaker, an entrepreneur. He's done, I mean, he's just a really incredible human. And he talks about how he writes his keynotes. He gets on stage and delivers a keynote for months or however long he does it and gets feedback from the audience. And from his keynote, he develops the book,
Yeah.
which makes so much sense because you're getting real-time feedback, and I really find that to be interesting way to write. In fact, when I was writing my book, it was in the Clubhouse days where that app Clubhouse was
Oh,
big and
mhm.
everyone was on there. So I was doing a segment for a community in there, and I was able to share some ideas with this community, and I was getting real-time feedback. I was like, "Oh, this is an idea that people really resonated with. I should probably keep that in the book." So, I think that's really helpful in the writing process. So, I think that's a great idea for people, especially starting out, to maybe do some short form content to put
Yeah.
things out in the world and see what works. If you are on Threads or Instagram and you just share some ideas, you'll start to notice. And you also start to get a little bit more comfortable sharing your work, because
Mhm.
I would assume if you don't share your work often and then you write this book, it's going to be a little daunting to say, "Hey, here are all of my ideas that I've never talked about
I know.
publicly."
Here's this whole, I mean, that's how I felt when I released my book. Like, here's this whole secret history of myself that I have never talked about before, and I'm just gonna spill it all out at once. Like,
Yeah.
it's very intimidating.
Oh, I
Yeah.
can't even
Yeah.
imagine. All
But
right,
I
Emily, I always ask my guests this one question, and it's, what activity can the listeners do in 10 minutes or less to live a more creative life?
ooh, pick one story that your heart is excited about today. One, it can be a fictional story, but as a memoirist, I always think like one piece of your life that's been top of mind, and take 10 minutes to tell just 1 minute of that past experience, right? Like, don't focus on trying to cover a whole month of time or even a whole day. Like, just focus on 1 minute and write the story of what happened in that 1 minute. And often, for me at least, when I isolate like that little sliver of time from my past and try to write second by second how it's unfolding, that's where the real magic and the richness and the detail and also the meaning of that experience comes up for me. So that
I
would be
love
my
that.
suggestion. Focus on what happened, what you felt, and what you did next.
Beautiful. Oh my gosh. Well, Emily, you are so awesome. It was so lovely chatting with you. Thank you so much for sharing all of your writing knowledge. You have so much to share. And I encourage everyone to check out your Instagram. You share really great writing tips, and people have ideas they want to share in the world. So I appreciate the work that you do. And I know a lot of people are going to get a lot of value out of everything you shared today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Emily Gindle, and the memoir mastermind that I run is called Tell Your Story. It's at tellyourstory.academy. So people can find me in either of those places.
And seriously, if you need someone to guide you along with your emotional memoir journey, there is no better person than Emily to do that, based from experience that I've had. And so, if writing a memoir is in your future, you need to connect with Emily.
Thank you.
I could have talked to Emily for hours. She is so knowledgeable around writing and what it takes to create great work, and something that you're really proud of. And so I hope that you got something out of this episode as well. Every time I talk to a writer, author, anyone that does this work, I learn something, because we all have similar experiences, but in our own unique way. That's what I found interesting about Emily's advice too, is that some of the questions I asked her, there was no blanket, this is what you should do. This is how your routine should look. This is what you have to do in order to become a great writer. We all go through our own journey to get the work out into the world that we really know is meant for us. And there's a lot of value in that. So I hope you love this episode as much as I did. And I hope that you do the activity that Emily suggested at the end. I know I'm going to. I love those little 10-minute activities that our guests give us. They are just so rich, and they help us to live a more creative life, which is what it's all about. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, go create something.